One more year syndrome is one of the most dangerous traps on the path to financial independence, and honestly, on the path to any meaningful life change. You hit your number, or you finally have some breathing room, or you reach a point where you could make a change, and instead of stepping forward, something holds you in place, a whisper, a wobble, a subtle tightening in your chest that says, "Not yet, just one more year, then I'll be brave." And that's how people, smart, disciplined, intentional people, lose years of their life. Today, we're shining a massive spotlight on this pattern, why it happens, how to spot it early, and how to know with clarity and confidence when you're actually ready to walk into the next chapter of your life. You've built the career, you're building the portfolio, you're close to freedom. So what now? Welcome to Life After Enough. Money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. I'm Nick. I'm racing towards early retirement and figuring out who I become when the job no longer dictates what I do with my time. Let's get into it. One more year is one of the most deceptively reasonable sentences in adulthood. It sounds smart and responsible. It sounds like the kind of thing a level-headed, financially literate professional would say. But underneath all that logic, in most cases, one more year is just fear dressed up as strategy. People don't say, "I'm scared of freedom," or "I don't know who I am without this job," or "I'm terrified of making a mistake with my life." No. Instead, they say things that are far more acceptable, like, the markets are a little bit unstable. Inflation's creeping up. I feel better with a slightly rounder number. Let me just get through to this next project or promotion or bonus, and then everything will be fine. All of those are perfectly valid concerns. Every excuse feels rational in isolation. But when every year produces yet another rational excuse, you're no longer being prudent. You're avoiding the deeper question. If the spreadsheets say you're ready, why doesn't the rest of you feel ready? Because most of the time, one more year isn't actually a financial decision. It's a control decision. Your spreadsheets become a kind of emotional anchor, your emotional support animal. Your workplace routines feel familiar, even comforting. Your inbox, as much as you claim to hate it, actually gives you structure. And outside of that structure, outside of that title, that identity and that predictability, well, there's a blank page. And blank pages terrify people who've spent the last 15, 20, or 30 years climbing a corporate ladder. A ladder that gave them meaning and momentum and a ready-made introduction at parties. So one more year feels safer than stepping into a new chapter you haven't fully designed yet. Also, because this sets up some of the other things we'll talk about in the episode, one more year syndrome doesn't just hit people on the path to fire. It can show up any time you have a small amount of financial breathing room. A little bit of FU money, some savings, a bonus sitting untouched, a few months runway. Suddenly, you could take a sabbatical, switch to a healthier job, or scale down your hours, or start that thing you keep saying you want to try. But instead, you tell yourself, "Not yet. One more year, then I'll be brave." This episode is about understanding that pattern, both financially and emotionally, so you can recognize when one more year is truly strategic and also when it's simply fear keeping your life smaller than it needs to be. Okay, let's just park everything I said for a moment, because one more year isn't always the villain, even though parts of the FIRE community love to make it sound that way. Firstly, you don't owe anyone a big dramatic exit. Financial independence does not have to mean marching out the door with a cardboard box and a slow motion soundtrack behind you. FIRE is supposed to give you options, not ultimatums. Yes, one option is, of course, to step away from your career completely. But another equally valid one is staying in the job, just giving it less of you. You're allowed to choose freedom without retiring. That's not a half measure or doing FIRE wrong. That's actually conscious design. And in certain stages of life, it might be the smartest, most grounded choice you can take. An extra year of income can strengthen your cash buffer, top up sinking funds, or cover a big expense you know is coming down the line. It also smooths out the brutal reality of market timing. If you're about to step into retirement during a weird economic cycle or a shaky market, staying one more year can dramatically reduce sequence of returns risk. And then there's the part no one really talks about. It also buys emotional runway. And that's a really big one. Sometimes you just need that extra time to build an identity outside of work, experiment with new routines, get your life in motion, and let your confidence catch up to your numbers. If that's the reason you're staying, that is intentional. That's grounded and is so healthy. There is nothing wrong with that. But this is where it kind of gets tricky. There's a razor thin line most people don't notice. One more year is so powerful when you choose it from clarity, when it's a conscious design, when you're staying in a job you actually like, even though you don't need the money. However, it becomes dangerous when you choose it from fear, when you stay in a job or an entire career that no longer fits you, when the extra year isn't about stability, but it's actually just about avoidance. And the frustrating part of this whole thing is that those two states of mind actually feel identical in the moment. One keeps you steady, but the other keeps you absolutely stuck. And most people only realize which one they're in years later. Okay, one of the major issues with one more year syndrome is that it almost never stays 1 year. It quietly becomes 2 or 3 or 5 or even a decade. Why? Well, because every single year presents a perfectly logical reason to stay. Markets will wobble, inflation will creep, your family might need you, your life feels too big to risk it. There's always going to be a rational reason to delay, every single time. But when you zoom out and stop looking at the spreadsheets and look at your actual life, the cost becomes impossible to ignore. You're not trading money, you're trading time. Time that doesn't compound, time you don't get back, and time when you might never be this healthy or mobile or energized again. A really interesting paradox is that most people who get stuck in one more year syndrome actually have the financial safety that they need already. They're not building their first buffer. In fact, they're building buffers on buffers on buffers, not for survival anymore, but for psychological comfort. And that's when one more year stops becoming prudent and starts becoming this big stall tactic. For those people, the real blocker isn't the money and their portfolio. It's actually the emotional part that they haven't built yet. The courage to step into the life they've planned. The identity that isn't tethered to a job. And the trust that they will figure things out once they're no longer hiding behind the work. Money can take you right to the door of freedom, but it will never walk you through it. One thing which won't become immediately apparent from fire blogs is that freedom is far more psychologically confronting than work. Work, even the work you dislike, has something incredibly powerful going for it. It tells you who you are. Every morning you wake up and step back into a story you already know, a title, a routine, and a clear sense of what today means. Even if you're exhausted by it, even if you fantasize about leaving, work still gives you an identity on autopilot. And when you're thinking about stepping away, there's this moment when suddenly you realize, if I stop doing this, who exactly am I? And what am I going to do? That moment is what creates what I call the identity gap, a gap between the person you've been for years and the person you haven't met yet. And that is where one more year syndrome becomes incredibly sticky. Because staying at work, even when you don't need to, is just easier than sitting in that gap. On the one hand, work gives you structure, validation, a sense of usefulness, and a ready-made identity, whereas freedom gives silence and space and possibility, uncertainty, and you. And for a lot of people, that silence is far more intimidating than the work ever was. You can see this when people retire and suddenly feel lost, when they take a sabbatical and spiral, when they quit and spend 6 months staring at the ceiling wondering what comes next, only to go back to the very same career they spent years trying to quit. The problem isn't the absence of a job, it's the absence of a replacement identity. And the real stab in the back is that work doesn't have to be good to give you identity. It only has to be familiar. So then we stay. Not because it gives us any sort of meaningfulness, but because the identity gap feels too big and too undefined and just too exposed. This is the psychological gravity underneath 1 more year syndrome. You're not afraid of leaving the job. You're afraid of leaving the identity that comes with it. And that's why this next part of the story matters, because I've been in that gap too, more than once. Quick pause. If this episode is sparking something for you, hit follow so you don't miss what's coming next. Feel free to share it with someone who'd love it too. It really helps the show to grow. So here's the part where I have to hold my hands up, because I'm not just talking about you here, I'm talking about myself as well. I'm saying this as someone who is currently in year 2 of 1 more year syndrome. Not because I don't trust the maths on my beautifully made spreadsheets, but because the rest of my enough just wasn't ready yet. For me, there are 2 big reasons why I'm continuing on the 1 more year cycle. The first is identity. I haven't fully landed on who post-Fi Nick is yet. I'm definitely closer than I was. The sabbatical really helped and cracked open a lot of clarity. I spent 6 months trying on new identities without detonating my life. That work is ongoing and I'm not done, not even close. And I don't want to walk away from a wonderful team, a career I built from scratch in Singapore, and a sense of stability, only to step straight into psychological freefall. I want to leave towards something and not just run away from something. There's also the parenthood piece for me. My husband and I are thinking seriously about kids, and that adds an entirely new dimension to the question of enough. Becoming a dad will be the biggest identity shift of my life, bigger than when I quit law in the first time in 2016, bigger than moving countries, and definitely bigger than hitting my original fire number. I'm very aware that if I try and leap into that chapter without anchoring myself first, I'll end up recreating the same patterns and imbalances. So yes, some of my 1 more year is strategic, but most of it is just deeply emotional. It's giving myself space to build the version of Nick who can step into fatherhood, step into freedom, and step into the next chapter without dissolving who I am. I'm not afraid of the money side, but I'm just making sure the identity side is ready too. The second reason I'm intentionally doing 1 more year is simple. My original fire number belongs to an older version of me. 2020 Nick set that target. He was excited, inexperienced, and running away more than running towards. But my life is so much bigger now. I'm married, we're thinking seriously about parenthood, and raising kids, especially as a same-sex couple, navigating surrogacy and international schools, visas, and building generational stability requires just a different level of planning. So of course, my number had to evolve. And here's the other big shift. I'm no longer thinking in extremes. Back then, it was all or nothing. Quit the job or stay forever. But now, I can see a middle path. Maybe I don't have to retire early. Maybe I just work part-time or shift back into consulting. That flexibility is freedom as well. So yes, I'm in 1 more year, but it's not fear-driven anymore. It's strategic and thoughtful, and I'm genuinely okay with that. So after everything I've just shared, all the experiments and the sabbatical and the evolving fire number, the part I really just want to underline so it hits home is that the path forward doesn't have to be binary. The choice doesn't have to be quit the job entirely or stay full-time forever. Real life is more of a slider than an on and off switch. And 1 more year becomes genuinely useful when you stop treating it as a countdown and then instead reframing it as a window of time, a space where you get to just reshape your life while keeping the stability you need. And that could be turning your job into a 4-day week, moving from leadership back to an individual contributor role at work, switching to consulting, and building new routines and identities in parallel, not as a replacement. This is the part of the fire conversation that almost never gets airtime. You don't have to burn the old life to start the new one. And actually, the people who transition the smoothest are the ones who don't spiral or panic or boomerang back into work they hate. They are the people who give themselves time to build the bridge. Enough space to test what life could look like on the other side, build practical and emotional competence, and let the transition stop feeling like a cliff edge. This is also why I've stayed an extra year, but to evolve, to do the identity work while anchored, and to build the foundations for future parenthood in a way that feels steady and not frantic, and to create a vision of freedom I can actually step into, not fall into. And I think that's the middle path. quietly, intentionally redesigning your relationship with work whilst you prepare to take the next step. I just want to pause there and say that one more year syndrome isn't just a fire problem either. You don't need a multi-million-dollar portfolio to fall into it. Most people experience it long before they're anywhere near financial independence. One more year shows up the moment you've hit even a tiny bit of financial breathing room, such as a small buffer, some FU money, or a window to change direction, and you don't take it. It's the one more year before I take a sabbatical, one more year before I switch jobs and leave a toxic team, one more year before we move countries, and one more year before you start that business you've always talked about. This is the quieter version of the trap, and it's the version that just steals life's richness and experiences, not just retirement dates. Because once you've got any sort of financial margin, your life becomes way more flexible than you think. But most people will wait anyway. Why? Well, because adults are trained to tolerate discomfort, not pursue change. We're brilliant at endurance, but terrible at giving ourselves permission to pivot. And I get it. I saw this up close when I announced my sabbatical. Most colleagues were excited, supportive, curious, and sometimes a bit jealous, but in a good way. But a few went immediately into fear mode for me. What if someone takes your job? What if the company moves on without you? What if there's no seat for you when you return? That mindset makes total sense if your job is your identity. If the role is the anchor, then losing it feels like losing yourself. But here's the part that surprised those people. I wasn't worried. Not because I'm reckless, but because I back myself. I trust my ability to rebuild and reinvent and stand on my own feet if the ground does shift. And that's what identity enough gives you. Not ego and overconfidence, but self-trust and inner stability. The kind that makes a sabbatical feel like a training rep and not a risk. And that's where this whole lesson lands. You don't need full financial independence to make a meaningful shift. You just need enough stability to stop operating from panic. And that's why the one more year trap is universal. It convinces you to delay things you are already able to try. So, if one more year isn't automatically bad, and if reaching your FIRE number doesn't automatically mean you must walk out the door and quit your work, then what does being ready even mean anymore? Well, the truth that most FIRE conversations tend to skip is that you don't need perfect conditions to shift chapters. However, you do need two kinds of readiness, and most of us only build one. Let's look at the first one, financial readiness. This is the structural foundation. This part is still the maths, but maths for the life you have now, not the life you had when you first built the spreadsheet. Financial readiness means your plan works on paper. You've stress tested for messy realities. You've built buffers, and your number reflects your actual life today. Financial readiness doesn't mean quit now. It simply means the math is no longer the bottleneck. And that leads us to the second limb of readiness, which is emotional readiness. And this is the one that's the real decider. This is the part most people avoid and is the reason why one more year often quietly stretches into 5. Emotional readiness looks like you're moving towards something, not running away from a job. That your identity isn't welded to your job title. That you've built other identity pillars outside of work. That you've experimented enough that your next chapter isn't a blank void. That you trust yourself to adapt even if life throws you curveballs, and that you're not expecting stepping back, scaling down, or going part-time to magically fix you. Emotional readiness doesn't mean confidence without fear, but it does mean fear no longer makes your decisions for you. So when both readiness types line up, even imperfectly, what you get is then this beautiful moment of choice, clarity, and a sense of direction. It's at that point that you can redesign your work on your terms, shift a few days, change careers, take a sabbatical, focus on family, and yes, if you want to, walk out the door if that's the right move. The point, though, isn't the exit. The point is that you're finally choosing from strength and not fear, from identity and not avoidance, and from intention and not panic. That's what ready actually looks like in real life. So to close out this episode, instead of asking yourself, should I do one more year? A far better question is, if I froze my life exactly as it is today, is the only thing missing more money? If the honest answer is yes, then maybe one more year is the strategic choice. But if the answer sounds more like, I don't know who I am outside this job, or I'm not entirely clear what I want to do next, or my identity is still welded to work, then you're not waiting for the money. You're waiting for clarity. And as we just discussed, clarity arrives when you experiment with your life, when you try things, test things, and build identity outside of the spreadsheet and outside of work. That could take 1 more year. It could be 2, it could be 5. The timeline doesn't actually matter. What matters is that you're moving with intention and not fear. That's the difference between delaying your life and designing it. Thanks for listening to Life After Enough, a podcast about money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. If this episode made you rethink your future, share it with someone who's starting to question the script too. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Nick, and I'll see you next week as we keep building a life that's truly ours.